Good morning, everyone. You're watching our mid-morning edition of Arirang News on this Wednesday, May 13th, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Shin Se-min. And before we begin, these are the stories we're following at the top of the hour. Eye-watering job losses in South Korea for a second straight month. The number of jobs slumped by over 476,000 on year in April. In a bid to turn the tide, the country's finance chief says the government plans to create some 550,000 new jobs. America's top doctor of infectious diseases warns about the potential perils of reopening the U.S. economy too soon. He says it may result in needless suffering and death. And with economies cautious to reopen, the IMF says a global economic outlook for 2020 will likely be downgraded even further. Plus, regional players on the Korean Peninsula, South Korea, the U.S., and Japan will be holding a virtual meeting today for talks on security and COVID-19 related issues. Our starting point this morning, South Korea's jobs fell in April at the sharpest pace since 1999 as efforts to contain the spread of the COVID-19 outbreak forced businesses to shut and kept people home. Now, the services sector bore the brunt of those job losses. And for more on this, we have our Ji-young on the line for us. So, Ji-young, what do we know about the latest job figures?
Samin, according to data released by Statistics Korea on Wednesday, the number of employed people was around 26.6 million, down 476,000 from the same month the year before. The employment rate for those between 15 and 64 years old was around 65.1% last month, down 1.4% on year. Job losses were mostly from service industries, which require face-to-face interaction. The restaurant and lodging sectors saw 212,000 job losses compared to the same period last year, which was a 9.2% on-year drop in employment. South Korea's education sector was also hit hard by the outbreak, losing 130,000 jobs on year. And the wholesale and retail sector saw 123 job losses in April compared to the previous year. An official at Statistics Korea said the restaurant and lodging sector saw a drop in sales as the number of tourists plunged and people stayed home amid the outbreak.
And Ji-young, following today's job number release, the government officials are also discussing plans to cope with the difficulties on the job market.
Yes, Samin. At emergency economic meetings on Thursday this week and next week, officials will discuss ways to create more than 550,000 jobs as soon as possible. At a meeting earlier on Wednesday morning presided by Finance Minister Hong Nam-ki, officials agreed that they have to focus more on providing support for those who are hit hardest, including people who are self-employed or have temporary or part-time jobs. That's all I have for now, but I'll bring more updates in a later newscast. Back to you, Samin.
Thank you, our Ji-young with the latest on the country's job front. Now, the International Monetary Fund says a further cut in its global economic growth prospect is very likely as economies worldwide have suffered more than expected due to the COVID-19 pandemic. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said Tuesday at an online conference that it is very likely that the IMF will release a downward revision in June because recent economic data for many countries was below the fund's already pessimistic projection. She also said that the IMF expects a bit more bad news in terms of how they view this year to pan out. In April, the IMF projected the global economy to contract 3% this year, the sharpest downturn since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The director of the U.S. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Anthony Fauci, says the country could face more COVID-19 deaths and a wider outbreak if it decides to reopen prematurely. Our Kim Hyo-sun with the details.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, America's top infectious disease expert, is warning the U.S. could face needless suffering and death if the country opens up too quickly.
If you do not do an adequate response, we will have the deleterious consequence of more infections and more deaths. And that's the reason why you quoted me, Senator, quite correctly in everything you said, and I will stand by that. If we do not respond in an adequate way when the fall comes, given that it is without a doubt that there will be infections that will be in the community, then we run the risk of having a resurgence.
Testifying remotely at a Senate hearing Tuesday, he conveyed the danger of reopening the country prematurely. Fauci is one of 4 top government doctors scheduled to testify remotely at a hearing before the Senate Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee. His comments come as President Trump has been encouraging states to end the weeks-long closure of major businesses and begin to reopen the American economy. Meanwhile, Broadway theaters, which lower their curtains beginning mid-March, will remain closed until September 6th. In a statement Tuesday, the Broadway League said the exact date to resume performances is still yet to be determined, adding all shows are suspended until further notice. The move comes as social distancing guidelines and stay-at-home orders remain in place in New York City, with some parts of the state not reopening until May 15th, with the city expected to reopen much later than that. Kim Hye-san, Arirang News.
South Korea, the United States, and Japan will be holding their 12th annual defense trilateral talks on this Wednesday to strengthen their cooperation on security front. According to Seoul's defense ministry, senior defense officials from all 3 sides will discuss ways to deal with the COVID-19 situation, achieving complete denuclearization and peace on the Korean peninsula and other security issues. Now, the meeting was originally set to be held in Japan, but will take place online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. A multilateral cooperation body on joint COVID-19 response, dubbed the Group of Friends of Solidarity for Global Health Security, initiated by South Korea, launched late Tuesday with its first video conference. Seoul's foreign ministry said some 200 professionals, part of UN groups, scattered across some 30 different countries, went online for the inaugural conference. It was jointly chaired by South Korea, Canada, Denmark, Sierra Leone, and Qatar for the frank sharing of information on global health security. And South Korea's Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa said she hoped the group will serve as an active channel for boosting cross-border cooperation, and added that she thinks the worst has passed for her country. And Seoul also plans to launch 2 other groups with other member nations of the WHO and UNESCO later this month. China has imposed a partial lockdown on some regions after some new COVID-19 infections sprouted in the country's northeast and the original epicenter, the now infamous city of Wuhan. Our Lee Seung-jae explains.
15 COVID-19 infections have been reported in China's northeastern Jilin province, raising concerns again of another outbreak in the country. The Jilin government has ordered the closure of all but the most essential services in the city of Shulan and instructed its citizens to remain inside. With the exception of medical and essential workers, all residents are prohibited from leaving their homes. Just one family member will be allowed out to buy daily necessities. All bus services in Shulan have been halted. Taxis are also prohibited from driving into or out of the city, and train services are suspended until June 1st. The measures come as the virus in Shulan has already spread to the nearby Liaoning province. The original epicenter of COVID-19, Wuhan, has also been locked down again after 6 new cases were reported after the city reported no cases for a month. Quarantine officials have been dispatched to Wuhan and have been conducting nucleic acid tests to trace the source. The Chinese government is concerned the resurgence in infections may again lead to the postponement of the country's largest political event of the year, a meeting of legislative delegates and political advisors known as the 2 sessions. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Time to open up your wallets and start shopping, as the government's cash payouts will be delivered starting today for the first few Koreans who applied for it, and that money will hopefully boost consumer spending hit hard by the COVID-19 epidemic. Payments given out in the form of card points will be available for those who applied for the money on Monday this week. And that, mind you, money will need to be spent by August 13th. Otherwise, it'll be donated or used to support those who lost their jobs or have been put on unpaid leave during the coronavirus pandemic. The South Korean government recently decided to temporarily give the green light to use virtual medicine appointments, or telemedicine as it's more commonly known, in a bid to slow the spread of the COVID-19 outbreak. Our Kim Do-yeon with more.
Oftentimes, people are just too busy to visit a doctor in person when they're ill. However, thanks to South Korean government's recent decision to temporarily approve the use of telemedicine, one can speak to a doctor online and even get a prescription. The patient has to first fill out a form describing their symptoms and select a convenient time to speak to a doctor, and the app will connect the two virtually. This doctor is asking the patient to show him her eyes more closely. When the doctor is done with the examination, the patient can pick up their prescription at a nearby pharmacy as the doctor sends the necessary forms online.
The prescription was ready by the time I got there. It saved me a bunch of time.
When COVID-19 arrived on South Korea's shores in February, the government decided to greenlight this system on a trial basis. Since then, 130,000 prescriptions have been written using telemedicine services in the country.
With mild illnesses and conditions, doctors can complete the screening online. We have systems for internal medicine, pediatrics, dermatology, and OBGYN.
While 26 countries out of 36 OECD countries have telemedicine systems in place, the need for it has been amplified in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the system is not a fix-all for everything.
Doctors need to conduct physical examinations when patients have fevers, pneumonia, large coughs, or asthma.
Despite this, the local medical sector generally agrees telemedicine will only continue to grow, and South Korea is looking for ways to make the system even more advanced. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Early last month, South Korean students began their delayed school year via online. And creating a system that millions can use all at the same time wasn't an easy task. It involved the unprecedented process of sharing confidential information by a number of big-name firms. Our Kim Bo-kyung tells us more on how they all came together.
Unprecedented. This is how the engineers who were in charge of making online classes possible described the situation at the time. Companies normally prepare for a year with closed launches and beta tests before releasing a full service. But this time, engineers had just a few weeks to make it possible for 3 million students to use the cloud service at the same time for online classes.
At first, we only had to provide the service for high school students in Daegu and Gyeongsang-buk province, but we ended up having around 3 million students nationwide. The pre-existing EBS software learning platform could only be used by 2,000 students at a time, so there were 1,500 times as many students as usual in less than a month. It was unprecedented.
To make the unprecedented number of online classes possible, Microsoft and several domestic IT companies such as Bespin Global joined together and shared confidential information. Microsoft provided the cloud service, which is the foundation on which Bespin Global created the infrastructure. Although it was considered impossible at first, engineers say they tried their best because they felt a responsibility to help students start their delayed semester.
Usually we provide services for a specific company, but this time it was for all the students in South Korea. We have this sense of duty that we need to let them attend classes and get back to normal school life even though it's online.
The experts put their heads together to find solutions to their impossible challenge.
We even had a war room where all the companies and education ministry officials worked together. We would share information to solve errors rather than blaming each other.
This cooperation and teamwork made online classes possible in South Korea. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Good morning. It was a chilly start to the day in most regions, but afternoon highs will go up to the 20s by the afternoon. So beware of big temperature differences today. Gyeongju and Daegu should get up to 26 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Daejeon and Gwangju topping out at 23 degrees under plenty of sunshine. So there will be very high UV levels across the country. Don't forget your sunblock and sunglasses. Meanwhile, those of us in central regions and on the East Coast will need to be aware of strong winds today, with eastern parts of Gangwon-do province seeing winds ranging from 10 to 15 meters a second. Good news though, we'll have normal to good air nationwide today. I mean, the last couple of days were a bit dusty, but the volume of ultrafine dust particles in South Korea this past winter was 27% lower than the last winter season. That's Korea for you, and here's the international weather for news around the world.
And that does it for this edition of Arirang News. As always, thanks for watching.